Good evening, and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 29th year of programming, I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. Sometimes our writers are journalists, sometimes they're historians, sometimes they're poets. We even have other brands of artists on. We've had sculptors and musicians, actors. It's a pretty wide net. If you have an idea for a guest who might be good for the Writer's Block, either a writer or some other brand of artist, watch for our address at the end of the program. We'd be very happy to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block is a production of 1623 Studios for and about Cape Ann. It's a cable access program, meaning it is created by money from cable accounts. You don't get this service, an important cultural service, with Dish, so stick to cable. Tonight, I'm very happy to say we do have a writer, an accomplished writer whose name may be familiar to you because he's been a journalist for many years on the North Shore, and often his articles appeared in the Gloucester Daily Times, having transferred up here from Salem News or earlier the Lynn item. His name is Tom Dalton, and he is a longtime friend of mine who many years ago was born in Boston, then moved as a child to Newton and later Wellesley. He was educated at Colgate and later went to Illinois State University, where he studied to become a participant in the VISTA program. He later returned to his home state of Massachusetts. He wrote for the Belmont Citizen. He wrote for many years for the Item. He wrote for the Salem Evening News. And I'm going to, in addition, read to you a short paragraph about Tom that appears in the back of the book that we're going to discuss. Tom Dalton is a former Lynn Historical Society board member and retired reporter for the Daily Item of Lynn and the Salem Evening News, who shared more than a dozen awards from the National Association of Newspaper Columnists, New England Associated Press, New England Press Association, and others. Tom Dalton, welcome to the Writer's Block.
Thanks, John.
Your book, and I'm going to hold it up and we're going to plug the daylights out of it. Your book is Frederick Douglass, the Lynn years.
Right.
I've heard you mention in lectures that nobody knew that he lived in Lynn.
Well, I didn't know.
How did you discover that?
Well, I didn't discover it, but I was working at the Item, and I got a phone call from a retired editor, Vincent P. O'Brien, who I'd never met. He was a very distinguished guy who I'd heard about, and he called and he asked, this is 1990, and he said, "Are you watching the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War?" And I said, "I was watching it a little bit." And I was a little nervous talking to him. I wasn't sure where he was going. And he said, "But you know, Frederick Douglass is featured in that, and Morgan Freeman is doing his voice." And I said, "Well, I didn't know that." And he said, "Well, do you know that Douglass used to live in Lynn?" And I had no idea. I was blown away. So I said, "Absolutely not." And he said, "I think it would make a good story." So here's this guy I've never met, but he's got such a reputation. I decided I better follow his advice. So I did several stories on Douglass back then, and so early 90s, and up. Go ahead.
Maybe we should in parentheses say who Frederick Douglass is.
Yeah, I mean, he is.
Give us a little one paragraph bio.
The first thing I'll say about him is he's dead. The President of the United States had him living a few years ago, but he died quite a while ago. So Douglass was a slave, and who gained his freedom and became, this is in the 19th century, so he is generally considered the most prominent or important African-American of the 19th century. So he lives from 1818 to 1895. He had his own newspaper. He wrote hundreds of articles. He gave literally thousands of speeches, and he was considered sort of the voice for the 3 million slaves in the country. He later became a recruiter for the Massachusetts 54th Infantry, which was very famous. That's featured in the movie Glory. He was an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. Several other presidents appointed him to key positions like U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. He was the highest ranking black official in the country. So He's someone who starts as a slave. He escapes. He teaches himself to read and write. It's fair to say he is a genius. If you read what Douglass is writing, it's so brilliant. It's so incredible that.
So he escaped as an adult, or a young adult.
He's 20 years old. He tried earlier to escape and fails.
He was illiterate.
Well, he taught himself before the age of 20.
Before he escaped.
He had an interesting life as a slave, if I can phrase it that way. He's a slave on a plantation in Maryland, but I think even they realized something about him, so they sent him to Baltimore twice. Once as a little boy, there was the brother of his master lived there, and so he actually lived with his family and sort of was a companion for their child. Later, he was sent back to the plantation, went through some terrible years of beatings, but later, in fact, after a failed escape, rather than selling him to the South somewhere in slavery, his master sent him back to live with his brother again, and he got a job. His brother worked in shipyards, in fact, owned a shipyard at one point, and so Douglass got a job as a ship's caulker on the wharfs of Baltimore, and he was a very skilled worker.
Was that rare for a black person to have that kind of
it was, and he faced a lot of prejudice and was beaten up, but it was unusual. A lot of blacks there in Massachusetts worked on ships. It was one place you could get a job. I was looking at Salem had a large black population. When you saw a large black population like in New Bedford or Salem, generally it meant they were a seaport and they could get jobs on ships. So Douglass, but when Douglass was in Baltimore is where the woman who was the wife of the family he's living with, she actually started to teach him. He showed a lot of interest in the Bible, so she started teaching him the Bible, teaching him to read. But then her husband got furious because she said the last thing you want to do is teach a slave to read. But then Douglass had some freedom, so he knew white schoolboys on the streets of Baltimore. He borrowed their lessons. They helped him out, and he learned on his own. He bought a book called the Columbian Orator. They used to have it in schools, and it was just speeches. But he read them, he memorized these speeches, and so he did it all on his own. And it helped to be a genius, but he did it on his own.
I was struck by the cover of your book, Frederick Douglass, The Lynn Years, because of the portrait of him. He's a very, very good-looking man. How old is he in this picture?
He is about 30. He's about 30 years old, and he was. Funny, we saw that picture. I went with my wife to the Museum in Boston of African American History on the bottom of Beacon Hill, and they had a display, an exhibit that I think may still be up on photographs of Frederick Douglass. And I saw this photo in that exhibit. I'd never seen one quite like that, and it makes an interesting point about Douglass. He was actually fairly light-skinned. You see that mentioned a lot when people are writing about him, that he was fair-skinned, and his father obviously was a slave master, and his mother was a slave, so he's half white and half black, and so and he joked sometimes that for some audiences he was hardly black enough. He used to say, my hair isn't kinky enough. He would say, but he was a very handsome guy, and he was a tremendous. We've heard Dr. King speak, but Douglass was a tremendous speaker. He would sing sometimes. He would tell stories. He's this handsome, charismatic guy.
What year did he die again, Tim?
So he dies in 1895.
Were there recordings made that early?
I don't think there are any recordings of Douglass speaking. But it's a good question. There were.
I'm not sure when the first discs or rolls were produced.
I don't think there are any recordings of Douglass, which is a shame because you hear. In those days, when they gave a speech, they would speak for 2 hours sometimes. If you can imagine that, they would go on and on, and so.
But you discovered from this fellow journalist's question that he spent time in Lynn.
Right.
How did he get from Baltimore to Lynn? And did he work in shipyards in Lynn?
Well, no. Well, I'll start with Baltimore. He escapes in Baltimore in 1838, so he's 20 years old, and he escaped he kept it a secret for a long time, but he dressed as a sailor, wore a sailor's outfit, and someone gave him sailor's papers. He jumps on a train, he goes to New York City, and is panicked when he gets there because people are always looking for There were slave catchers everywhere, but he's taken in by a man there named David Ruggles, and Ruggles is the one who sends him to New Bedford because he knows that Douglass has this skill as a ship's caulker. New Bedford's a big seaport, so he goes there, and while he's in New York, I should add, he is fallen in love with a woman in Baltimore, Anna Murray, and Anna comes to New York and joins him, and together they get married in New York, and together they go to New Bedford, live there for 3 years, have 3 children. And but he's speaking. He gets more involved with. There's a big black community in New Bedford. He gets more involved with.
Excuse me, because of the shipping.
That's why he went there.
That's why there's a large population of
right.
blacks.
There were a lot of jobs, and so it wasn't just. There were a lot of runaways like Douglass there. A lot of free blacks living there, and but the irony was he went down to the shipyards and couldn't get a job. They said, "We're not going to let a black man work as a ship's caulker, which was a skilled job. He could have worked on a ship at these as a mariner. There were lots. That's what most black people did. But so Douglass mainly did laboring jobs in New Bedford. He had a rugged life there. But he started speaking at churches and at public meetings on abolition.
And then what year is this?
So we're talking 1838, 39, 40, and at one point, a white man comes to one of these meetings and hears him and is blown away. And he says, you got to come to Nantucket. In August of 1841, there was the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society was having its annual convention in Nantucket. And it goes on for 3 days, and Douglass goes over. And he sort of nervously sits there, and at some point they finally get him to get up and say a few words. And he starts, he's never spoken before white people. That's largely who's in this group. And he starts to speak, and people are so amazed. And William Lloyd Garrison is there, who's the most prominent abolitionist in Boston. He's the editor of the Liberator. And Garrison just about jumps up when Douglass is done and talks to his audience to believe this man, whatever. So on the spot, they asked him, they said, we want to hire you for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as an agent. Now, agents were traveling lecturers. They would go from town to town giving speeches opposing slavery. So Douglass, I'm sure he said, I don't even know what that is. I don't want to do that. I've got a family. I've got 3 kids. But they got him to agree to do it on a trial basis for 3 months. So
this all happens right at the convention, on Nantucket.
Right.
And he was invited just to observe, and he leaves with a job.
Now, the mystery in Douglass's life, we know why he went to New Bedford. We know why he makes other moves in his life. We don't really know why he came to Lynn. There was a...
Nobody does.
No, but it's really...
Nobody knows why they go.
And I've read many biographies of Douglass, and nobody can really answer that, but there was a man at that meal. I'll tell you one reason. When he comes to Lynn, he's very close to Boston. They just put a railroad through in Lynn a few years earlier, and he lives right next to the railroad tracks. So from there, he can go everywhere, and he can be in Boston in just a few minutes or in 25 minutes. And Garrison is there, the Anti-Slavery Society office is there, the Liberator. So, but there's also at that meeting, what we think is at that meeting in Nantucket, there was a man named James N. Buffum, Buffum there. He's a wealthy Lynn guy. He built half of Lynn, becomes mayor of Lynn later. He's a dynamic guy. His house was a refuge on the Underground Railroad. We think Buffum had a lot to do, and Buffum gave a speech years later sort of saying he was part of the ones that hired Douglass. So we don't know for sure, but I think Buffum encouraged him and said, I'll get him settled in Lynn. Lynn's a good spot for him. But coming to Lynn, he's going from New Bedford. I was looking at the 1840 census. So this is 1841. So in the 1840 census, New Bedford had like 1,000 black people living there. Lynn had 44 free blacks because there is no seaport, there are no jobs. So he's coming to a totally white community, which makes, his wife was...
What was the population of Lynn at the time?
Like 9,000.
So it's a fairly big community. Yeah,
and Salem was a little bit bigger, and but your black population is less than 1%. Uh-huh. But he comes there, and just to go back a little bit, when I started writing about him a little bit at the item, I realized fairly quickly how little was known and how much contradictory information was out there. And when I look back at what I wrote, I realized a lot of what I wrote, not a lot, but some of it was inaccurate. They never had the full story. And I later, when I left Lynn, I served on the board of the Historical Society. And I realized then the the Douglass story was pretty incomplete. And so when I retired, I thought, can I look into this? I decided, I'm not an historian, but I thought if I just...
Well, you are now.
Well, yeah, but if I just look at primary sources, if I just look at old newspapers, if I read his letters and do something, not me writing about him, but just let him speak through his letters, let him speak through the newspapers. And so I spent, off and on 2 years going lots of places, reading letters, searching old newspapers, and it was...
So in terms of just that subject, Douglass in Lynn, you are the authority, right?
Well...
I'm not making it humorously. I
probably at this point do know...
It's not well studied, so...
Yeah.
And which brings me back to the fact I want to plug the book. We're speaking to the authority on Frederick Douglass in Lynn. Where is this book available, Tom?
You can get it at the Lynn Museum,
okay,
or online. It's something called Lulu, LULU.com. Lulu's the largest independent publisher. They're based in North Carolina, but so you go to Lulu, LULU.com, and there's a search box. Just put in Tom Dalton, not Thomas, but Tom Dalton, and the book will pop up. So, and one thing I did with this book, and in writing it, I didn't know that after I finished this in Lynn, this year happens to be the 200th anniversary of Douglass's birth, and I wasn't aware in Lynn a committee formed of just private citizens who were going to put events on this year. And so when they kind of heard about me or met me, and it was sort of serendipity, but they said, okay, you're our major event. And I said, oh my God. I just wanted to hand the thing over, and say, that's it. And so all of a sudden I was...
so you are the authority. You're the go-to Lynn Douglass historian.
Well, it's funny. I ended up speaking there. Then somebody else I got called from the First Church of Roxbury, and I was their annual History Day speaker. I went to the Hawthorne Hotel in
I
Salem.
saw you at an event at the Hawthorne
Right.
Hotel, which is very well attended.
I was shocked myself.
Big wedding or dance area that they have behind the restaurant is full.
I think it was all people I offended as a reporter for the Salem News who were coming for vengeance.
I did hear that muttering in the background in the last row.
So, but the proceeds from the book, one thing I did work out was all the proceeds go to this committee in Lynn that's private citizens running all these events this year, Douglass-related events. So it ended up serving a good cause. How much
is the book, Tom?
So online it is $15 for a paperback and $25 for a hardcover.
Is it available any other
That's the only thing
locations?
We've been selling it.
Sure.
This Lynn committee has been selling it at their events. But the only place it's available is at the Lynn Museum, which is right downtown in Lynn, across from the Capitol Diner. If anybody knows Lynn.
I know the North Shore Community College has a copy in their Lynn campus.
The public library has one, and a few other places have them. But the easiest place is probably online.
So you mentioned when I misdirected you. You were talking about the population, the black population of Lynn, and Douglass coming up there, and in a virtually all white community,
right.
And that presented some problems.
Well, I don't know if it did. I mean, he spoke fondly of Lynn the few times he did, but what was interesting is he comes there with, and at first when he comes there, one thing I had to do was, when you look at anywhere you look, you can go to the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site or somewhere else, they all have timelines for his life, and everybody gives a different year when he arrives in Lynn. And you think it would be simple to pin down, but I think I actually did pin it down. And what's confusing is he arrives, I think, just on his own, and his wife stays back with their kids in New Bedford. He comes in 1841, not that this really matters. She comes the next year with the whole family, 1842, and they stay there till 1848. But when he was in Lynn, and one reason why it's so difficult to find a lot of information about Douglass, as I said, he was working as a traveling lecturer or agent for the State Anti-Slavery Society. So in that job, you traveled tremendously. And he traveled all the way out to Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, all through New England. So I actually kept, when I did my research, I kept note cards, and I did Douglass his whole life for those years, day by day, as much as I could. I had hundreds of cards trying to track every day.
Whoa.
I'm a little obsessive compulsive, but
Well, I mean,
I then added it up at the end, and he was away from Lynn about 2/3 of the time he lived there. He was on the road, so his wife is the one who's really home in Lynn all that time. But he's away an awful lot. He still got quite involved with Lynn, but he was on the road a lot. So
I want to mention the illustrations. This is a very nicely put together book. Is there an image of some of the characters you've mentioned, I think? This is Buffum, Mr. Buffum, who takes credit for introducing Douglass to the Anti-Slavery Society.
you know, one thing that's important about Buffum, he's sort of he's a footnote in abolition history because the most important thing that happens to Douglass in Lynn, I mean, one reason the Lynn years are important is he comes there, and it's in Lynn that he starts his career as an abolitionist. It's in Lynn that he gives his first recorded speech. It appeared he was speaking in Lynn, and a man who happened to be from Pennsylvania, a pacifist, came and heard it and couldn't believe this man. So he wrote it down, and he goes back to his Pennsylvania paper, and they run, and historians study the speech because Douglass gives thousands of speeches and is so famous. So they wondered, what did he say at the start? So that Lynn speech is very important. But the most important thing in Lynn was he wrote his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. He writes in 1845.
Right in the middle of his Lynn term.
In the middle of the Lynn years, and he writes it because it's important to say here, sort of background, I probably should have said at the start, his real name is Frederick Bailey, escaped slave Frederick Bailey. He changes his name to Douglass for protection. But he's speaking at so many places, and more places he speaks, people are yelling out, "You weren't a slave. Come on, nobody can speak like that who was a slave." So finally he says, against the advice of many people, he says, "I'm going to tell my story." So he comes back to Lynn in the winter of 1844-45, and I think we've pinned down, it was in a little house by the railroad tracks in Lynn. He wrote this book that is considered one of the great books, one of the great nonfiction works in American history. The Library of Congress named it one of the books that shaped America. But it was a very dangerous book to write because in it he gives his own name. He says who his slave master was. He names people in the South, including ministers, who beat slaves and committed crimes and murders. So when the book came out, it was so explosive that Douglass literally fled to Great Britain. People told him, "You've got to leave. The slave catchers are going to come for you. They know who you are. You've named all these people." So Buffum, the face you just showed, goes with him. And Buffum travels with Douglass and spends a year with him in Great Britain. So when you read about Buffum, that's usually when you see big biographies, that's all they'll mention is, oh yeah, and he had this sidekick. But Buffum is a pretty prominent guy in Lynn. As I said, he went on to be mayor and a state legislator, and he built 400 houses in Lynn. He was an amazing guy.
There are a couple illustrations in here of basic drawings of houses that may have been where Douglass lived.
That's another one of the mysteries. You know, the records are so thin in Lynn that we don't have the directories. The cities had directories. They're just starting to do town directories, and there's one for 1841, there's one for 1850, but the one for 1841 is before he arrives, the one for 1850 is after he left. And I've searched for records of actually, in fact, they're just starting to put numbers on streets too, so for his address, and people wrote him in Lynn, you see envelopes, Frederick Douglass, Lynn, Massachusetts, which doesn't help you at all to find out where he lived.
But old envelopes with that.
But when he died,
Gloucester and Rockport.
When he died, there was a town historian who wrote a recollection, 1895 in March, in the Lynn item, in fact, he writes this recollection about his memories of Douglass. Now, why it's important is this man not only was a Lynn historian, he lived right next to Douglass at one point. So he can pinpoint exactly one house, and when he says other houses, it's pretty authoritative. So we're pretty sure he knows just where Douglass lived. And so that's why I do a map in there of where Lynn's Lyceum was, other buildings, but also the houses where he pinpoints Douglass's living. So
I want to mention technically again, this is a wonderful book, a very readable book. It's about 60 pages long, and I want to recommend it because I was a history minor, And I know that this is very, very carefully researched, very, very well written, and it's available through Lulu, and it's available at the Lynn Museum and the Lynn Library, or events of the Lynn Historical.
If you want to take it out, you can take it out of the Lynn Library. But
and I want to ask you, we're almost out of time. I want to ask you what you would advise to somebody who's thinking of doing some historical book. What kind of timeline should they allow themselves? Do you recommend it at all, or is it just too damn hard? What advice could you give to viewers who are thinking of doing journalism?
I think the first thing before you do research is to read a lot. And I read books about this period in history because I'm not an historian, and I wanted to understand who the presidents were and what the politics was. And I read a lot of books I read biographies of Douglass. I read biographies of Garrison and other people who were, so I probably read, 20 books or so.
How long did this take?
A few months. But before I started research, it was just me, I guess. Because if you don't know a lot going in, you'll miss something when you read a letter. You won't know the reference. You won't understand the context.
Then you go back and have to redo all your cards.
Right.
Because you discovered one detail you should have been aware of all along.
You've got to arm yourself with as much knowledge as you can before you plunge into things. I read, hundreds of letters by Douglass, but then I finally knew who he's talking about. I knew who this person was, so I knew it was important. I knew if it related to Lynn. So
I'm going to have to begin to close here because one of my last shows went over, and I'd
like to go on for a few more hours.
I got barked at by our director,
I
Jim
brought my pajamas.
Capillo. Not really barked at, but I want to make sure that I don't go over this time to mess up our scheduling. I want to remind everybody that we've been talking about Frederick Douglass, the Lynn years by Tom Dalton, who was our guest tonight, a longtime North Shore journalist whose name may be familiar to you. It's a wonderful book, worth reading, and I want to recommend it. Thank you for being with us, Tom.
Thanks for having me, John. I appreciate it.
Thank you out there in TV land for being with us this evening, too. If you've learned something about Tom Dalton's excellent biography of Douglass during his Lynn years, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.